What's the difference between a NASA lithograph, a NASA photograph, or a repro photograph? Well, if you're an astronaut autograph collector or a historical autograph collector, this is something you should probably know. So stay tuned for this information and more on the next episode of Collectibles Chat. Hi, and welcome to another edition of Collectibles Chat. I'm Steve Zarelli, Zarelli Space Authentication. I provide professional authentication of NASA and space-related autographs, cosmonauts, and aviation to collectors, dealers, and auction houses worldwide. Welcome to this episode. Today, I want to talk about the different types of photographs that you often see in the space autograph hobby. Primarily when images are signed, there's three types of images that you would see. The first being a NASA lithograph. The second being a NASA photograph. And then the third is a repro or reproduction photograph. So let's look at all three of these types of images to tell the difference. So when you buy, you know what you're buying. Because there is often a difference in price between what the image is that's actually signed. So here we go. The first category is an official NASA lithograph. Now these were typically produced in 8x10 size, and they're not lab-produced photographs, they're lithographs. So by definition, a lithograph is something that's printed on a printing press using a four-color process, like a magazine or a comic book or an art print, for instance. These were produced in great quantity by NASA back, when the space program, the Apollo era, Gemini era, Mercury era, and these were, distributed to schools or to educational institutions, libraries, etc. And they were also made available for autograph request. So they printed these by, the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. And this is what astronauts would often use to fulfill mail requests that would come in. And even after they left NASA, I think astronauts would get shipped boxes of these by NASA so they could continue to use them to fulfill requests. So these very often had a logo on the back. So here's a Neil Armstrong 8x10 NASA lithograph that's signed. You can see there's the old meatball logo on the back, and the logo would correspond with the era that it was printed. Once the worm logo came into use in the 80s, then you would see the lithographs would have the worm logo on the back. Here's an Apollo 17 crew. You can see the logo on the back with a description of the mission. And last but not least, here's another example. An Apollo 11 crew signed 8x10 NASA lithograph. Has the logo and mission description on the back. So one thing to bear in mind is that lithographs weren't always printed on the back. Sometimes the back would be blank. Typically you'd see this earlier in the program, like the Mercury era lithographs or the Gemini era lithographs. You'll see a lot of the business suit lithographs. They might just have like the astronaut's name stamped on the back, but otherwise it's totally blank. Typically the lithographs always did have a description in the bottom margin and some sort of plain typeface that would describe what the topic of the lithograph is. So these are very desirable for NASA collectors, and typically a lot of collectors like to, when they're building a run or a collection, they sometimes want to focus and say, well, I want to have all 8x10 lithographs, or I want to have all NASA glossies, which is the next category that we'll get into. The NASA 8x10 photograph is an actual lab-produced photograph on photographic paper. Unlike the lithograph that was produced in mass quantities, the NASA photographs are available in much lower supply. And very often they're very collectible in and of themselves. Even on sign, sometimes NASA glossy photographs, the classic images of Apollo 11 and the Apollo 8 Earthrise and Gemini 4 Ed White spacewalk, those photographs just by themselves can be worth many hundreds of dollars, if not more. But they are very desirable also to get autographs on. So here's an example. Here's a Charlie Duke autographed 8x10 NASA photograph. Typically the NASA photographs would have some sort of white margin around the edges. You'll sometimes see what's called the red serial number on the side. And very distinctly on the back, they have typically the NASA logo with some sort of description, and it's in blue, and almost like it's a blue mimeograph. If you remember those old mimeograph machines, if you're of a certain age, that's what looks like that's what they use to print on the back of these things. Here's another example. Here's a Frank Borman signed NASA photograph. You can tell the photograph's kind of old. It starts to get a little curl to it. This one does not have any manufacturer's marking on the back in terms of the photo stock. This one is, the Charlie Duke says Kodak. This one is blank, but it's clearly a lab-produced photo. It has the blue mimeograph markings on the back as well. So what makes the photographs desirable is that they were produced in much lower quantities than the lithographs. And why is that? Well, the photographs are what went in official NASA press kits. So when they had press kits to distribute to the press or other government sources or some sort of, dignitary or something, this is what they would use in those press kits. So these photographs were produced in much, much lower quantity than the lithographs, and that makes them desirable. In terms of price and premium, typically signed NASA photographs do carry a premium over lithographs or reproduction photographs. And finally, we have the 8x10 repro or reproduction photograph. This is a lab-produced photograph. However, it wasn't produced by NASA. Here's an example. A beautiful 8x10 photograph signed by Frank Borman on Fuji Crystal Archive paper. Great item, nothing wrong with it. However, it wasn't produced by NASA. And that's where the repro photographs really come in handy, is because NASA didn't produce every image as a lithograph or one of their photographs. An image like this is not available that way. So through the repro photographs, you can get poses that were never available through official NASA releases. There you have the three categories: NASA lithographs, NASA photographs, and repro photographs. But I'm going to throw you a curveball right now. Signed by Jim Irwin. It's a lithograph. You can see it has the print across the bottom, like we discussed earlier. So is this a NASA lithograph? Well, the answer is no, it's not. It's a reproduction of a NASA lithograph. Jim Irwin sent these out after his NASA career, and it's inscribed with a pre-printed "His Love from the Moon." Now, obviously, NASA was not producing lithographs with pre-printed inscriptions that said "His Love from the Moon." So this is something that Irwin had done himself. It's very, very similar to a NASA lithograph. However, it's a little thinner. It's not quite as thick as the NASA lithographs that are official, but it's a good replication of one. So this is something that Irwin sent out from his office, and these exist in great quantities, very desirable, collectible, but it's not an official NASA lithograph. So wrapping this up, a lot of collectors like to have consistency. It's part of the collecting mindset. So collectors will like to have a set of something, and typically, if really picky collectors will say, well, I only want NASA lithographs, so everything's consistent, or I only want NASA photographs, or, there's nothing wrong with repro photographs either. So, that's something just to kind of bear in mind when you're collecting. What do you want it on? If you're someone who's not picky and doesn't care, well, then you can have a mix and match. I mean, it's something that I don't super focus on. If you're talking about terms of value, Typically, the NASA glossies, because they were produced in the lowest numbers, have the most premium attached to them. So if you were to have a Neil Armstrong signed NASA glossy versus a lithograph versus a photograph, typically the NASA glossy would command a higher premium than the lithograph, and the lithograph higher than a repro photograph. So that's kind of the pecking order. NASA glossy, NASA litho, and then the reproduction photograph. Bear that in mind when you're looking at items and pricing them out. What it's on can make a big difference in price. Well, that slams the lid on things for today. Hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, do all that stuff. I appreciate it. Hopefully I'll be back to see you again real soon. Until next time, happy collecting.